my involvement has come out of applying quite a long time ago now, it feels, for the teacher fellowship programme on transatlantic slavery of Britain and transatlantic slavery. And as Kate said, we received quite a lot of training through that on a 3-day residential, and really opened my eyes to a history that, as David Olashoga has said, is largely forgotten in many cases, and not taught in schools as much as it should be. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Sorry, in terms of the research that I've done and where I started with this. I also thought I'd share the kind of the places that have really really inspired me. This was my first slide originally, and when I saw Kate's, I realised that we basically started with the exact same thing. I think it's really interesting to think about the way that our history is visible, and how much of the visible history is missing the British history, in terms of who we have statues to, who we commemorate in visible ways. And I think the toppling of Colston's statue was a brilliant way of highlighting something that's all over the country, and is a really interesting part of how we can look at history with our students, because it's not just the past, it is the public understanding of the past, the study of the past. We're not just saying, you know, there's a statue of it, that's how it was. And I think that this is a great time for us to, as history teachers, to kind of harness something that people are already really interested in, and something that people are already talking and thinking about a lot. I can't be the only history teacher when they were seeing all this unfolding was really devastated not to be in schools and actually talking to students directly about this, because it was so interesting and so important. You know, it was really upsetting to be in lockdown whilst all this was going on, effectively. But a lot of where I've kind of come from in terms of what I've been thinking about with this, we were given Emma Waterton's article to read on the fellowship, and I think this was really inspiring to me in terms of what I was thinking, especially where she talks about collective amnesia and national forgetting, and how that reinforces and sustains oppressive power relations, and how often we see those things happening in the media, and in the way that things are talked about online, and how there has been this collective forgetting and collective denial that this history is still important today. And I think I felt really fired up as part of the fellowship in my role to undo this kind of collective forgetting for the students that I teach. So that really, you know, that's an important part of what I was trying to do with the project and with the resources that I created. And before all of the Colston statue stuff was going on earlier this year, there have been other things coming up about statues. There was a plan for a statue to commemorate the victims of slavery to go up in London, which Boris Johnson approved when he was London Mayor, but that at the moment I don't think is going ahead because it's been refused funding. So there is all sorts here going on in terms of the way we publicly commemorate, the way that we publicly share our history, that I think is a really, really good way to get our students involved in local history. As has already been said, and I'm glad it's been they've been kind of promoted already. Justice history, a really big influence behind the work that I've done. The first 2 units that our students study are heavily borrowed from the Justice to History resources that they've shared on their website, which you can see there. And my approach has been heavily influenced by Abdul and Robin and their book and their involvement in the fellowship. So you know, thank you to them and how much they've influenced what I've done in preparing what I'm going to show you in a bit. And also reading Black and British, and particularly the forgotten history bit, the fact that this is a history that isn't taught enough, and it is almost forgotten, and I think there's a lot being done at the moment, which is brilliant to kind of tackle that problem, and how it is history, it's not just Black history. I thought I would share this. I know Carla's been mentioned a lot already, but natives, race and class and the ruins of empire also heavily influenced what I've done and the approach that I've taken. I've used extracts from natives selectively, but I've used them. Some of the language in there was perhaps a language I wouldn't share with students without some preparation, but there's extracts in our schemes of work from natives and from Black and British. But in terms of thinking about the impact of this kind of collective forgetting and the impact of the way in which we think about British history in quite a narrow form, without thinking so much about the British involvement in the slave trade and the legacies of that, I think he talks about the impact of that quite articulately, and I thought I would share this, and I'm going to keep my fingers crossed it works.
Every generation pretends gang crime is a new problem. So when you look at the press reports they cite in their scholarship, it's this same sort of sense of moral panic, this unprecedented thing. When actually we've had violent teenage youth gangs for 150, 200 years, maybe even longer. And the social indicators of that violence have remained identical for almost 200 years, as have the sort of facile explanations about.
And those social indicators are?
Poverty, domestic abuse, lack of education, so expulsion from school. So for example, almost half the people in prison today in Britain were expelled from school as children, versus just 1% in the population as a whole. Among young people, about half the young people in young offenders institutes were at some point in care growing up, versus about 1% in the population as a whole. So social indicators have remained identical. Explanations, or what we call moral panics, this sort of idea that just having enough police or just having tougher sentences will work. A good friend of mine, Dr. Baz Dreisinger, did a PhD looking at prisons all around the world, and she didn't find any correlation anywhere between tougher sentences and reduction of crime.
So those people who analyse it as a race problem,
yeah,
these are black gangs, these are Asian gangs, these are...
This is fascinating. I mean, let's just look at the maths. There are 1.2 million black people in London. In a bad year, 50 of them will kill someone. That's less than 0.004% of the black population. Therefore, anyone that thinks that blackness is a sufficient common denominator for violent crime clearly doesn't even understand what a common denominator is. Just to contrast, in a bad year in Glasgow, say 2005, there were 40 murders. There were only 600,000 people in Glasgow. So that year, a Glaswegian as a whole was twice as likely to be killed as a black Londoner. Whereas the commonalities, when you actually look at the demography of violent crime, the commonalities remain the same in Glasgow, Liverpool, Belfast, Naples, or London. Racial explanations are sort of way out for the powers that be, a way out for the wider society. And it's revealing that what happens in London is black on black crime, even when the person committing it is like me, has one white parent, one black parent. Okay, what happens in Glasgow, race is not important.
So I think that's a good example of how this collective forgetting or collective amnesia is creating a situation where these myths and these racist ideas are perhaps more unchallenged than they should. Well, they should be completely challenged, but they're not going challenged as much as they should be. And if we are equipped with more knowledge about the British legacies of the slave trade, the British involvement in the slave trade, then we are giving our students a greater chance of being able to tackle or not be taken in by some of the racist ideas about people today. So I think I've been heavily inspired by these ideas and by the fact of these very modern ideas. This isn't something that is in the past. This is something that has legacies to this day, and I think that's what fired up lots of the people on the fellowship, and all of us on the fellowship. We're incredibly passionate about doing something about these issues in our own kind of little way, and I think that's what we've been really excited about doing. So one of the things that was shared on the fellowship by Robin and Abdul was kind of where we are as a profession and as schools in terms of dealing with racism and dealing with race and issues around that. So lots of schools might say, well, we know there isn't an issue, we have strong policies against racism, we have strong policies in personal conduct and all of those things, and that we do teach the history of racism, or we teach the history of slavery and all of those things. But I think they certainly in the example of my school before I was involved in this fellowship, we felt like we were trying. We did feel that we were doing a reasonably good job. I think that was because we didn't know how much was out there that we didn't know about. We had this kind of ignorance of this history that wasn't being talked about as much. And that there were several things we weren't doing, and I imagine the case is true for lots of other schools as well, that we weren't thinking about helping students to understand systemic institutionalized racism. We weren't teaching students about the power relations behind racism, or even teachers about the power relations between behind racism. And we very much were teaching about slavery we skirted away from the British element of slavery very, very quickly. We taught the triangle trade, and that the fellowship was open-minded to how it's so much more complicated than that as well. But we talked about the triangular trade, and then we kind of moved over. We talked about the southern states, and we talked about plantation slavery in the US, and then we talked about the end of slavery in the US, and we went into the civil rights movement. So Britain and Britain's involvement in the slave trade, we made it clear to students that Britain was involved in the slave trade. We made it very certainly we tried to say, when we're talking about the triangular trade, we talked about Britain's involvement in it, but we didn't then talk about British plantations. We didn't then talk about the legacies. I didn't even know about the compensation payments until I was involved with the fellowship. So we didn't do any of that we've since introduced. And I think that's been really powerful in terms of changing our focus in what we've talked about. Is, I'm going to talk about using local history, but we didn't even teach this really as part of our national history. And that's, I think, a lot of what allows people to think that this history is other, that it's not British history, it's a long time ago, it doesn't affect us anymore, people should just move on. And it really terrifies me how much this is still being said online. But because we teach or we taught this at my school, we taught Britain was involved in the slave trade, and then it was abolished, and then we kind of talked about it in America, and we talked about the civil rights movement. It's as though none of that carried on in Britain, and that didn't have any legacies. Just by not mentioning it, it's like it wasn't there. So I think teaching the local history and teaching the British transatlantic slave trade and its legacies is really, really important. It was asked earlier on at the end of Kate's about the principles. I'm going to shut up for a minute to give people a chance to read through these. And when I applied to the fellowship, these principles were shared at kind of the application stage. So when I wanted to apply, I saw these principles, and this was what made me so passionately want to be part of the fellowship. Having read through these principles, I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what I want my teaching of this to be. That's exactly what I want to do in my teaching of this. How do I do these things? My teaching of this didn't come close previously. So if I shut up for a minute and give you a chance just to have a scan through and think about, as you're having a look at these, how far do you think your teaching or your learning of about the transatlantic slave trade fits into these principles? Okay, sorry if that wasn't enough time, but I'm just aware time is getting a bit pressing as well. These are available on the link for the fellowship page. There's a PDF of them in there as well if you wanted to look at them in more detail. But hopefully, reading that, you see elements that you feel like you've experienced or you've taught using these principles, or there's ones on there that you think you wanted to develop as part of your practice. But these principles for the fellows on the fellowship, we all felt that these really encapsulated kind of what we wanted to do in terms of how we taught this, but that this felt like quite a steep learning curve, and also that it felt like a very a big responsibility to try and meet as many of these as we could. And what we tried to do was to, in our inquiries that we developed that will be being published soon, we all tried to identify which ones we were particularly focusing on. And I think mine really thought about representation and memory, because I look a lot at how we remember the legacies, particularly, and the seventh one on legacies as well. Hopefully they'll be useful to anyone who's thinking about planning anything from this as well. So I also found for when I've seen online people talking about some of the things that people are still doing. I did a session at Reading Uni where I wanted to show the trainees some examples of the practices that are still being shared. I don't know by how many people, but certainly there were downloads of some of these activities, which I would encourage people not to use. But there are on TES, as we speak, freely downloadable resources that encourage people to reenact slave auctions, and coming up with bids for different slaves, and trying to think about how much they would want to pay for them. I would encourage everyone not to do that. If you think about the dynamics of your classes, if you know, it's just not a healthy thing to do. If the aim is to create empathy, I think there's a real question here. If we can really get students to empathise with the trauma and terror of slavery, we probably shouldn't, because that is traumatic. We should not be traumatising students in that way. If we can't really get them to empathise, why are we doing these tasks as well? So I think, you know, we need to think about the tasks we're doing and how we do them. Here we've got one thing, you know, trying to so what do you think this person would be thinking, as though that creates empathy in our students. And I would, and hopefully everyone else would argue for that, you know, showing students the evidence that we have, the primary evidence that we have of what people experienced and how people felt, rather than trying to reimagine those ourselves, because there is primary evidence available. There's someone who's turned it into a board game, the Slave Trade Triangle. So I would again encourage people to not to trivialise this history, and not to turn it into a game, because, you know, if we're doing this properly, students will see the severity and the importance of what they're learning about, and they should be engaged with the history, not through gimmicky tasks that encourage students to see it as a bit of fun. So I think, you know, we do need to use those principles to really treat this history with respect, to create a dialogue with students, and to engage with the history that's there, rather than trying to create tasks and where the activities engage students in perhaps quite meaningless ways, and or ways that are quite damaging. What we should be doing, hopefully, is using the resources that are out there and saving us time as teachers as well. It is a time-consuming job, and, you know, we're never going to be less busy than we're going to be in the next few months, with all the challenges that we're going to face. But there is a lot out there already, and hopefully, as I go through, you'll see that although I've done a lot of work on this, I've also had a lot of help from places that have done some of this work already, a lot of the work already. So this was already recommended by Kate, the Remembering 1807 page, and this is really where I started to get an idea about where my project was going to go for my fellowship inquiry. I had loads of ideas about what I wanted to do. I was really struggling to narrow them down, and when I saw this and I came across this document that was created, I kind of knew I'd found what I wanted to focus my students on in our lessons. Quite impressive storm going on here. I don't know if everyone else can hear it. So I found this document, Reading Slave Links. It was created by RISC, or RISC, and it's Reading International Solidarity Centre, and they've been working for years trying to get schools to teach more global history, and in the 1807 commemorations, one of the things that was produced was this brilliant booklet that went through the history of lots of different elements of the history connected to Reading. So that was enormously useful, and that was, you know, someone else had done all of this work. That saved me immensely. So if you are going to try and do anything in your local area, I'd really encourage you to look for things like this, and not to reinvent the wheel, because this was really, really useful. It had all sorts of useful things. There was a page in it on the Museum of Reading, so I'd started to think about, you know, maybe I wanted to include thinking about museums and how we remember, and this mural really got me thinking. I'd driven past this mural in Reading. It's right in the centre of Reading. If anyone knows Reading, you probably know this mural. I'd driven past this mural, I can't count how many times, and I hadn't thought that much about it. Seeing it on this booklet made me really think about this mural, and actually how much potential there was there for engaging students with Black history in Reading. because people put this mural there, and you know that there was an active decision-making process behind putting this mural up, behind creating this mural, and actually there's a whole campaign going on locally, or there was a campaign going on locally about this mural. So I thought this was a really good way of engaging students in Reading's Black history and looking at how Reading is connected to this wider international history. This is the Central Club. It's closed down now. It was closed down quite a few years ago, and the building, I'm afraid, looks even more decrepit than it now than it does there. But there was a campaign locally because the building was for sale, and there was a big campaign locally to protect the mural because there were real worries that if this building was sold on, I think it has now been sold, but there is protection over the building, over the mural, not the building, and that's where we start our lessons on Reading's links to the slave trade and links to Black history, which hopefully engages students with this history far more because they're seeing that it's relevant to them and where they live. The mural is right opposite the cinema in the town centre. It's right next to the biggest shopping centre. So you know, most students, when we did these lessons last year, most students knew enough students to get that kind of buzz in the room when they're, oh, I know where that is. That's just there, isn't it, miss? And that's there. And I drove past that yesterday. And you got the kind of buzz in the room of students being engaged and wanting to find out more. I thought I'd say as well about why focus on local history, but I think, to be fair, Kate's done a lot of that already. But I think it's really important that, you know, we should teach local history, and this is such a brilliant place to do it. In the department, we used to do a local history project where students could look at any element which had its strengths, but this is a really powerful place to do it because it really brings it home, and students see the relevance of learning about the history of the slave trade because they can see the direct impact it's having in the area that they live. It means it becomes much more real to them and so much less other. And it really challenges that kind of, it's not relevant to me, it's not relevant to my family, it's not relevant to my history because it's where they live. And also it means that the students that we teach who are of African descent or have Caribbean heritage, they see their history being dealt with respectfully and with consideration, and that engages them in the curriculum being taught as well. And we don't just focus on the slavery element in the project, so that I think that's helped as well. So I would really encourage anyone who's considering to do it. It's really powerful, and it does work really well for getting students engaged in this history. The other thing to use, and I feel like I'm jumping around now, but the other thing to use is the legacies of British slave ownership, which again Kate has shown already. But just starting perhaps with looking at the remembering 1807, or having a look on here to see if there's any anyone that jumps out, any locations that are particularly poignant to your students, any locations that students might be particularly engaged with. There is one estate on here that's got the same name as a local school, and if I was at that school, I really would be trying to find those links and to show the students the local connection. This is where I kind of ended up, and it took quite a long time to get to this specific question. Robin from Justice to History helped me a lot with it, but this is where we kind of got to, and this is the inquiry that our students study, which we introduce them to after looking at the mural and the campaign around the mural and why it's there and why people care about it. We ask, how should Reading recognise its connections to the history of people of African descent? And that's what they're focused on for the 6 lessons of the inquiry. So that you know where our students are starting. When they start this inquiry, this is a little way into Year 8, where they'll have already done the Justice to History inquiry on how far did New World slavery turn Africans into Negroes, and we do talk to them very carefully about the use of Negroes as a term. And we do an adapted version of a Justice to History inquiry, how far did the British abolition campaign improve the lives of enslaved Africans? And that's the knowledge that our students have before they start. We could do a longer local history inquiry where we bring in these international elements and we talk about the slave trade, the wider slave trade more within the inquiry. The way I planned it was part of the wider development of our curriculum because of the order we were doing it in, and because I wanted to have a really focusing on local history. We planned them as separate inquiries, but you could do it where you teach the whole history through a local focus. We chose not to, and these are the two that we've done, that the students have learned already. So I just thought I'd go through the 6 lessons really quickly. There's 2 that I think are particularly useful. This one I've explained already to some extent, where we get the students to look at the mural itself. We get students to look at the individuals who are on the mural and ask them, why do you think the people who made this mural chose to put them there? So it's kind of thinking about it from kind of an interpretations focus, but thinking about, well, why does this matter to the local community? Why did the local community campaign to keep this mural protected? Because we're really getting to think about the importance of this mural to people, and why so many people in the community really don't want to see this kind of little bit of Black history being removed, because there's not enough of it. There's not enough that we do to talk about Black history. So the kind of the really iconic bit of Black history that we've got in Reading, they really don't want to see that being removed, and we're kind of encouraging students to see that as well. So we get them to look at the individual figures on the mural, and then we ask, you know, why do you think they were chosen? We then get students to we start in the 18th century. We have put into year 7, I'm doing things out of order again, but into year 7 we've put an inquiry on Black Tudors. So students will come to this as well, knowing that there were Black people in Britain during the Tudor period as well. But we start this inquiry in the 18th century, and we get students to look at the individuals who we can document. And this came from a brilliant little trip to Berkshire Records office with the trainee who was working in the department at the time. We just had a brilliant time hunting through the records in Berkshire Record office. It took about 2 hours in total, because someone had done the work already. There's an organisation that had created a list of all the different places in the records for Berkshire where Black people are mentioned. So we were able to very quickly find the references to these individuals in the records. I think these 2 were interesting because they're referencing young people, but the way that they're referred to I thought was quite interesting, because we see them turn up in the baptism records, and we ask students, well, what can we learn from this? What questions can we ask? And there's I found some suggestion that in Britain, because of the unclear legal situation of slaves in Britain, that many felt that being baptized would be helpful to their status. But we've also, we've got people being referred to as Negro, which would imply that their status was not free, I think. So I thought it was really interesting that we see them coming up in the baptism records. We also see them coming up in the burial records as well. The next 2 were the ones that, well, particularly this one was the one that I found almost quite difficult to see the record of. The baptism of a 4.5-year-old boy is explicitly referred to as belonging to someone locally. It's 4.5-year-old boys whose status is that of a slave or an unfree person in Britain, and they were in Sunning Hill, which is not far from Reading. And as someone who went to school in Thatcham, seeing the records of a Negro servant buried in Thatcham, it was really powerful to see these specific local connections, to see this history and these handwritten records of people proving that there were Black people in Britain. What was really powerful, I'll go back, sorry, what was really powerful was at the end of this lesson, when I introduced to the students that we're going to be looking at the history of people of African descent in Reading, a student at the back of the room in one of my classes said, well, there isn't any. And I don't think they meant it in any offensive way. I don't think they meant it in any way that would be, they didn't mean it in any kind of derogatory way. I just think they just genuinely didn't know that there was a history of Black people in Reading. I think, that if you look at lots of the public discourse about it, it's after Windrush, and it's a modern thing that we see this history, rather than students seeing this as a history that goes really far back. So it was really powerful to teach this to a class where a student said that history doesn't exist, to say, well, look, here are the records, this really existed. And I did have a list of the, I'll find it. I did have a list from the Reading slave links of the records and list of the names, which is part of what I was working from, looking for the records in the first place. We can show students those links, those names, and say, well, these people existed in Reading at this time. But I think it was so much more powerful to be able to say to the students, look, this is the actual record. This is the actual document that someone wrote about this Black person who was in Reading at this specific time. I think that holds more power than just saying they were here. And I think that was really, really useful with students. They were more engaged because of being able to see these records. We then said, you know, we've got a local Black Boy pub. On their website, they make no reference of the fact that it may be that their name comes from one of the Black servants that existed. The lesson starts with looking at some portraits of Black servants in portraits, and we ask the students, you know, should the pub acknowledge this more if we're thinking about how should Reading recognise its history in connection to people of African descent? Should places like this share this link? Should places, and most students concluded yes, fairly enthusiastically yes, they think that this is something that should be shared more widely, and obviously I agreed with them. We then asked students and look at the people who benefited from the connections to the slave trade, and I think this was really powerful as well, and I think this really comes from Kate's approach with looking at a family history. And again, this isn't something I've done from scratch. I emailed one of my Year 11 students. His mum is works at the local library, and she's in charge of local history for the local libraries. And she'd previously helped us with some of the commemorations of the First World War stuff. And I emailed her and said, I'm working on this project, can you help? And she put me onto a few books and things that are in the local libraries that I read, or skimmed anyway, some of them, that gave me some information from books that aren't books that you come across on an Amazon search, anyway, that were really helpful. And that's where this lesson came from, looking at how people in Reading benefited from their connections to the slave trade. And there are lots of links. I don't know if the Blagrave family, I know that I found a mention that Blagrove and Blagrave might be the same family, or certainly connections to the same family. So I don't know if that's a connection to the Blagrove that Kate mentioned earlier, but there's a Blagrove pub, there's Blagrove Road, and there's links there to those names. There's stories of a woman called Anne Catherine Storer, who's linked to Purley, which is very close to Reading, where there's a court case where she's been particularly brutal to a Black servant in her house. But the main focus of this lessons is the Haynes family, and it came out of this book, Reading to Barbados and Back. And I think, you know, the author of this book chose echoes of British history very well, because the family are absolutely fascinating and really show how a family history can trace the history of the British transatlantic slave trade. So I skimmed through the book and picked out the key points in this family's history, and the key points, and obviously very much condensed down the history to share with students, and we get them to create a living graph on the status of this family, the wealth and influence of this family. Who's the person who wrote the diary that this book came out of was very much saw themselves as connected to Reading. The author of the book about this diary questions some of those connections, but you know, the family saw themselves very much as connected to Reading, and saw it as their kind of home, even though for generations the family was in Barbados and a slave owning family. They start off as a comfortably well-off family, and sail to Barbados during Cromwell's time because of religious differences. They set up in Barbados as landowners. They start plantation. They use indentured servants. But as the transatlantic slave trade kind of picks up, they quickly realise, along with lots of other British people, quickly realise that it's more profitable for them to use enslaved Africans that are being brought over in slave ships. And by doing that, they become wealthier. They're able to buy more land. They're able to expand their plantations. And over time and over generations, this family become richer and richer and more powerful. The kind of the male of the family becomes the captain. They then later generations, they become Major General Haynes. And they're expanding. You can see the records of them buying more plantations, expanding their ownership, and they become richer and richer, and become very, very wealthy. The General Major General Haynes was referred to by a friend as the island's most prominent citizen. He is important in the local National Assembly and helped to crush the Busa Rebellion. And also wrote about his opinions about the ending of the slave trade, which he was for, but his support for the continuation of slavery. There are accounts in his diary of how he felt that female slaves, even when pregnant, should still be whipped, because if you don't do that, you encourage them not to do as they're told. And there's all sorts of fascinating things that came out of this diary that really echo what the wider British history here. And I thought that was a really interesting way to get students to think about, and as Kate does, looking at individual families and looking at the individuals to really personalise this and to get them to see that they're not just nameless, faceless slave owners. These were people, and they had ideas, and look, here their ideas are. It seems that after the abolition of slavery, after he received the compensation payments, we see him turning up in the compensation record on the legacies of British slave ownership. After receiving that compensation, he returns to England. I think he lives in Bath for a bit, and then he moves to Reading. I believe that it's in one of these houses that he settles with, I think, his second or third wife. But it's a really interesting case, because you can see how this family that he always connected to Reading originally, that they, as the slave trade grows, the family wealth and status grow, they benefit from the slave trade extremely. And when the slave trade ends, that sees their status change. Their wealth stays very, very high, but their status changes because they move back to England, and there's suggestion that you just can't bear to be in Barbados where things have changed so much. And his ideas reflect a lot of what we see being said in diaries of other slave owners at the time. So I thought it was a really interesting case to get students to really engage with. This is a lesson where, as with my usual habit, I massively overplan it, so it could easily be 2 lessons. But that family, I think, is the one that we really want students to think about. To look at this person and their connections to Reading, and how they brought that money back to them to Reading and invested it in Reading when they arrived. And I think that's really interesting. We then think about the abolition campaign and the links in Reading. There was quite a strong Quaker community in Reading. We get students to think about those connections to Reading. That we show them an extract from the petition, Reading's petition to Parliament for the abolition of the slave trade, and think about that. But then we really want students to think about, having looked at the people who benefited from slavery, and looking at the people who tried to end slavery, we ask students, well, which is the most comfortable to remember? And we ask students to really think about the way in which we commemorate British history and the way in which we remember British history. We get them to read a bit from Akala and how we remember abolition, and it's much more comfortable to think about how British people that we might identify with were people who were involved in ending the slave trade, not the people who financially benefited from it and kept it going for hundreds of years. And we try again to connect it to places students might know. The local Waterstones in the High Street in Reading was the Broad Street Chapel before it was a Waterstones, where people really talked about abolition and tried to make abolition happen. So we tried to connect that history together, and we asked students, well, which is it more comfortable to remember? And lots of students acknowledge that it's more comfortable to remember the abolition campaign, but by this point, when we were learning it, they were really positive about remembering the whole history, because it all happened, and we shouldn't be so selective about the history that we learn. We then move on and look at more modern, we look at the kind of the 20th century, and we look at Windrush, and we look at the Barbadian community in Reading since Windrush, and think about, hopefully by this point the students have got the knowledge to really talk about and articulate the fact that as Reading has a big Barbadian community, that well, that's not the only reason that we should teach this history, but that those people shouldn't be left out of the history of the area, because the history of Black people in Reading goes back, we know, to at least, you know, we've proven to students to the 1700s, and actually there are records from the 1600s in the National Archive, in the Berkshire Record Office. So we ask students to reflect on the impact of not acknowledging the history when a proportion of the local community are people who identify as of African or Caribbean descent. If we miss out that history, what impact does that have on people? We link back to what Akala argues at the beginning about kind of the creation of ideas about race, and we talk about what they've seen before about Olusoga's argument about Black history is British history and all the richer for it, and we try and connect these ideas for students before we kind of take them into the outcome, where we ask students how Reading should recognise its connections to the history of people of African descent, and we go to the museum at this point, not physically, but we ask students to reflect on the purpose of museums and why museums exist, and I show students photographs from inside the museum and identify the two places in Reading Museum where there's any reference to the slave trade or to Black people in Reading, and we ask them, you know, what they think should be put in instead, and what they think Reading Museum should do to commemorate this history more effectively. I think this was mixed success when we did this the first time, and hopefully slightly more successful when we try it again this year. Asking students, what would you do instead? And the students' ideas were brilliant. The discussions we had were brilliant. The outcomes were okay, but I think the ideas that came out of it were fantastic. And students were really, really engaged with kind of righting the wrong of this history not being acknowledged and not being talked about as much, and they were really keen for the mural and for the history that they learnt about to be something that's publicly available to the people of Reading, and I thought that was really positive when we did it. I really enjoyed teaching this unit, and I think it's been really useful for our students to see the local connections, but obviously if you don't live in Reading, it's not going to be as useful to you. So I just thought there's a few things I would suggest if you are going to try to create an inquiry on the local legacies of the slave trade. Firstly, I said already that it was a contact at the local library that was really helpful. Recommended several books, but the Haynes family, the book about the Haynes family, was probably the most impactful on the inquiry as a whole. But having that connection, she also shared with me some stuff about the mural, which was hugely helpful in being able to use the mural more actively with students and identifying who nearly all of the individuals on the mural were. That was really helpful, and I couldn't have done it without her help. So getting in touch with local libraries, you'll find hopefully that there are local people who are a treasure trove of information about this. Find out what information has already been done. There's an organisation in Berkshire who looked at the archives and have a catalogue of all the different places where Black people are referred to in the archives. I couldn't have found the records that I did without someone having done that already, but I don't imagine that Berkshire is unique in that, and I imagine that for many places across the country that people have done that work already. So find out from the local archives if that exists already, and that would help. Using the Remembering 1807 website that Kate has mentioned as well, that was brilliant for looking at for finding the Reading Slave Links document that helped me enormously. Using the Legacies of British Slave Ownership website, using, like it says in the note, like Kate said, in the note section, typing the location, because that turns up a lot more information, or using the map section so that you can just hone in on the place you are and see the pins on the map of where local people were connected or received compensation payments, or looking at local stately homes. The Colonial Countryside Project have worked with several stately homes across the country looking at their connections. I think it comes up in a minute, but there's an article in The Guardian saying that up to a third of National Trust places have links to the slave trade. So the likelihood is there'll be somewhere nearby that has those links. In terms of when you create the outcomes, I think trying to connect the history to locations that students are likely to know, and using lots of photographs and maps to really help students to see this legacy, to see how this connects to their known world. And if you're including maps and you're including photographs a lot as well, it means that the students who might be new to the area or might not know that particular place, they can still feel connected to the lesson. You're not leaving those students out. And connecting it to the national and wider history, because we knew what students already knew because they'd done the 2 earlier inquiries, but my inquiry wouldn't work if you were starting that from scratch. Just thinking about what knowledge students have of the national and wider history that you're able to connect to ensure students have the contextual knowledge to place the local history in its context, and they can see its importance. Because the Haynes family living graph worked because students knew the history of the slave trade. So we were able to connect back to that history so that students could see the relevance of looking at the Haynes family in that way. That wouldn't have worked in the same way if they didn't have that knowledge about the slave trade. And I think also thinking about this in terms of a wider curriculum thinking, that ideally, as it said in the principles, you're not just teaching African history when it's connected to the slave trade. So we try to bring this history and bring more global history into our curriculum in a number of different points. The ones that are connected to this, so we look at the British Empire, and we particularly think about the connections to the slave trade there, and before they go on to look at the slave trade in more detail on its own. We also have shamelessly stolen Hannah Cusworth's inquiry, but hopefully she doesn't mind because it's shared on her Twitter page. How did Miranda Kaufman uncover the hidden lives of Black Tudors? So students know that Black people have been in Britain for a lot longer than just from Windrush. And one member of my department, excellent member of my department, thank you Catherine, has planned an inquiry on the Benin bronzes and looking at whether students feel that the Western Museum should return the Benin bronzes to Nigeria. So that's what they've learned before they even finish year 7. They then do the inquiries on how far New World slavery turned Africans into Negroes, and then the abolition campaign. So that's when they then start the legacies, local history stuff. We're also trying to amend our other inquiries because thinking about these principles, I thought there were a number of gaps in how we deal with our with this history in our curriculum, that we're trying to be more global in the way that we teach and think about the teaching a diverse history because the past is diverse. We start year 7 with an inquiry on Silk Roads, which came out of an enrichment project with some of Reading University's trainees, which were absolutely fab. We also look at, when we teach the First and Second World Wars, we're really careful to highlight the global nature of those wars and the involvement of Asian and African soldiers. So we don't just do kind of the British Tommy, we make it much more global. We teach the involvement of soldiers from all over the world and try and broaden students' understanding of that. And we use Will Bailey Watson's, Richard Kennett's Meanwhile Elsewhere tasks to try and broaden students' understanding as well. So although we focus a lot on teaching Black history and the way we teach Black history with our inquiries that are linked to the slave trade, we don't just focus on that because we don't want students to go away seeing Black people just in connection to the slave trade, although we do look at rebellion, we do look at the agency of Black people in the ending of slavery as well. Finally, and I'm sorry, I think I'm kind of running on a bit, my key messages, and I think a lot of these I've said already, but I might leave them up there just for a moment. And Sam, do you want to come in and tell me if there are any questions? I think I've seen lots of things pop up, so hopefully it wasn't anything going desperately wrong. It was just questions coming in.
Yeah, you mentioned at the start almost kind of where you started in terms of your research was with that Reading slave links leaflet. How did you find that? Because that looked very, very useful.
It was, if I kind of flick back, sorry if anyone was reading that, it was on this, and I should tech savvy enough to have done it, but I think it's literally on the next line down. If I scroll down a little bit, it was on this website. Because at this point I was kind of thinking, where do I go with this? Because there's so much I wanted to do. I really wanted to focus on the agency of women in resisting slavery. There's all sorts you can do with that. I had so many things going on in my head about what I wanted to do, and this document was enormously helpful in kind of narrowing down that focus, and absolutely invaluable to the project that you know, in terms of the work I did. So it was just on here. I think, you know, it's got them sorted by location on the left hand side, but I was literally just clicking through it, trying to look for something that really sprang out, and then that was it, you know, and that decided what I was going to focus on. So I imagine for lots of other locations, you can see there's a few there. I think what I didn't say earlier, what I think what's really powerful about doing it for Reading and not doing it for Bristol or for Liverpool or those places that have got that really established link to slavery, the students know that there's a link to slavery in those places. But I think what's really powerful about doing it to Reading, where students are able to say, there's no links, is that, well, if Reading's got links, everywhere's got links. This is something that is part of British history everywhere. This isn't just something that is part of the history of the ports. You know, that seeing how much a part of the national picture this is, by looking at Reading where you wouldn't expect, it's not a port, it's, okay, it's a big, centre in terms, it was fairly successful in the Industrial Revolution, it was a big manufacturing centre, it's got good transport links, all of those things, but students just wouldn't associate it with slavery because you haven't got that established history, as like Liverpool and Bath do with the local area, Bristol, where they've got this kind of established connection to slavery, and there's much more prominent local, you know, they've got museums of slavery in the cities. We don't have that in Reading. We've got a mural that most people drive past and don't really think about. So connecting Reading to that history I thought was even more powerful because people don't expect it.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic, and this resource looks brilliant. I think it's also the thing that I always think about, and I'm pretty sure there's no historical evidence for this, but it seems no coincidence that the huge compensation payouts coincide with the railway boom in the 1840s.
No, that's been tracked.
Oh,
yeah, on David Onoshoga did the program the legacies program he did on the compensation payments. I think, sorry?
It's up on iPlayer again, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, I think he picks out some of the names of some of the really, really wealthy compensation beneficiaries and tracks some of them and shows how much of the railway network was paid for using compensation payments. That's been tracked across, and that's huge. Yeah.
Sorry, Pam and Sam, just to interject, if you're very interested in the issue of railways, there's a whole subsection of the Legacies database that charts every single investor that we identified that invested in railways. There's hundreds of them, so it's a comprehensive accounting for those individuals.
Great, thank you, Kate. That's fantastic. A couple of other questions from me. You mentioned that you were kind of managed to find all that archival evidence of people living in Berkshire in this sort of 18th century. How did you get students to engage with those documents? Did they did they have transcripts? Did they have the original documents? And depending on what you did, how did they find that?
It was a bit of a mixed bag because we were actually teaching it kind of as we were teaching it. I got permission to use the documents when some of the classes had already done that lesson. So some of the students just saw the list of names, and one of the classes I taught, we printed out the documents on a printout. I think there's more that we could have done with that in terms of getting students to really look at those documents in more detail. In terms of timing, I was trying to keep it to a 6-7 lesson inquiry, so didn't do more with that. Students were, I think it was an issue of proof for students, that if I just gave them the list of names and said, well, that person was buried, that person was baptized, I think they'd have believed me, but it doesn't have the same impact where you can show them a photograph of the physical evidence and say, we tried to connect it by showing them kind of the journey effectively, because we physically went to, let's see the photos that we used. I physically went with our trainee at the time, Sophie, we went into the Berkshire Records office and we looked at the documents. So telling students about us physically doing that, I think was helpful, and showing them the handwritten documents. The trouble is that some of them, the students struggle to read what's actually written there. So we don't spend too long with students struggling to read them. But I think when I teach it the next time, touch wood and all that, it being a normal lesson, because it's in a few weeks, that I would give them the documents just on a Word document printed out for them to have a look, and what do you spot, what do you notice, and ask them to look at that first, and then show them, you know, this is what they show. I imagine there's more that could be done with that. But I think it was useful in terms of proving to students, you know, the skeptics in the room who were like, yeah, but how do you know? Well, here, this is the proof. And I think that was helpful.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? I am actually, in a couple of weeks, I've planned a lesson on looking at how it's essentially on the change from mercantilism in the empire, and looking at how much money was made from slavery, and have found court records of tax being charged on human traffic effectively. And I'm planning on giving it as it is to the kids with transcripts as a backup, just in case. So maybe we can compare notes in a couple of weeks and see how it went, and see how we can maybe make it a bit easier for them.
Yeah, I definitely want students to see the records, but I don't want that to switch. I don't want struggling with that too much to switch them off engaging with them. So I think it is a balance. But yeah, definitely see how it goes.